Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to a wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and the inferior wine after the guests become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of the signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and the disciples believed in him. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ. Please be seated.
So I've been told over the last few weeks that preaching with a mask on has not been effective. So I am trying something different. I have taken my microphone off, put it on silent, and using this so that my mouth has to stay here. So choir, hi, I can't look at you anymore like I would normally do in a sermon. I'm going to try it this way because I've been told it's important that the message comes through. I love this gospel. I've preached on this gospel many times, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it other than to make a few highlights clear to you. One is that the interchange between Jesus and his mother is priceless. The history of first century Judaism and weddings involved a great feast of hospitality that was necessary in order for the marriage to be deemed blessed. Running out of wine was a tragedy in terms of the way the marriage would be understood. They lacked hospitality. And so Mary realizes immediately the way that the wedding and the couple will be perceived. They've run out of wine. To which Jesus says, "Woman, what concern is that to you and me?" Now, for the parents here, if your son or daughter did that, even no matter what age there is, I guarantee that the reaction would be swift and clear. Notice that the next thing she says is, "Servants, do whatever he tells you." So it's clear that something else happened in the midst of this. Whether it was the raised eyebrow and the darting looks of "how dare you," or did she pull him along to the side and said, "Look, you can make a difference here. You're choosing not to is shameful and wrong." All we know that Jesus did act, so much so that the steward proclaims how amazing this circumstance is that you used such good wine on the already drunken guest. It's a great, great story. And it fits John's gospel perfectly. Because John's gospel is different than the others. Because where the others focus on Jesus' humanity in becoming one with God, John takes the alternate approach. At the beginning, Jesus was with God and was God. And so his life in Jesus of Nazareth, that human life, is God's way of understanding and being more in step with us. And so Jesus messes up here and there in John's gospel, not in his faithfulness, not in his understanding of the greater picture of God, but specifically in the way human beings experience life. And this is one of those examples where Jesus is right in the sense that in the long grand scheme of things, running out of wine is a big deal. But in the midst of that couple's marriage and wedding, it is critical. And to not do what one can do is wrong. With that, I want to say a few words about the virtues of Facebook. Yeah, not many people say the virtues of Facebook now. Mostly it's all negative criticism of Facebook, so much so that they have to change their name, right? But at its core, one of the best things about Facebook is the ability to reconnect with people from the past. I have one of those connections with a high school friend of mine who is a wonderful, devout Catholic, but also is very much in the spirit of justice. And so he often finds himself at odds with his Catholic faith. And I saw a post of his that talked about his frustration where clergy would not talk about the anger of Jesus. And so we started talking about it through Facebook. And we raised different elements of things on how Jesus did indeed get angry at times, but in the midst of the conversation, what he wanted to hear was when would Jesus condone violence? Because in his mind, social change has always had a component of violence with it when it's effective. And I honestly can understand his point of view and point to examples where a combination of things, including a certain amount of violence, has been part about bringing about social change. Likewise, the argument not to do because somebody committed violence is the wrong way to approach things. If the ethic is right, if there is an injustice, in pointing to someone who misbehaves as the reason not to do justice isn't fair. But I could not go far enough to say that Jesus did not condone violence by the way he lived his life. Jesus directly confronts the religious and political leaders, challenging their authority, showing them to be motivated by their own power and preserving their authority, rather than the well-being of others that God has entrusted to them. This is no small way motivated by Jesus' righteous anger. But, and this is key, for Jesus, fundamentally, it is about God's love and seeing God's creation in others. It permeates all his actions. Jesus does not resort to violence when he's angry. He does not seek to physically subdue the leaders, nor does he move the crowd and incite them towards violence. That's key to the way Jesus is presented in the Gospels. The way of Jesus now compels us into our own faithful action, focused on God's love for the world and all creation. That work is nonviolent justice that leads to peace, while even potentially, in the process, risking our own lives. Martin Luther King Jr. Day became a federal holiday in 1983 and was first observed 3 years later. Some states resisted, and it wasn't until the year 2000 that all of the states officially observed it. The tendency at that time, in most circles, was to focus on the March on Washington of August 28, 1963, specifically focused on the ideals of King's I Have a Dream speech. Perhaps the most quoted image, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. This is, of course, an admirable vision to embracing King's dreams. But deeper looks into his ministry and work are more difficult to embrace in our country. Religious News Service published the other day an article on King's last full year of life called Protest, Praise, Ire, Incarceration. The article notes, as he made more appearances in northern cities to protest segregation and unequal treatment of Black Americans, King's popularity began to drop. Surveys of the American public, as well as statements from other clergy and activists, showed the cost of shifting his focus away from the South and Jim Crow after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. The article featured a decision on October 1967 made by General Theological Seminary, this is an Episcopal seminary in New York City, to not include King, the 1964 Nobel Prize winner, with an honorary degree because, quote, the focus of the honors was on ecumenical work, and that King's principal contributions was not that of an ecumenical nature. Episcopal Peace Fellowship called the decision a shocking vestige in racial bias, and said he was indisputably among the foremost ecumenical leaders of our times. Quite apart from his commitment to nonviolence and moderation and the potentially revolutionary struggle for human rights, Dr. King has cut across all racial lines and uniting churchmen in ecumenical witness to the world peace. The seminary acted on popular opinion to preserve its power and its funding. And this was not an isolated instance where the Episcopal Church failed to embrace the ideals of King. However, many in our Episcopal leadership today see the need for different action. The canon and ordinary of Western Massachusetts, Rich Simpson, this morning posted an excerpt from MLK's sermon, A Knock at Midnight. King said, the church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. If the church does not participate actively in the struggle for peace and for economic and racial justice, it will forfeit the loyalty of millions and cause people everywhere to say that it is a trophy its will. But if the church will free itself from the shackles of a dead-end status quo and recovering its great historic mission, will speak and act fearlessly and insistently in terms of justice and peace, it will enkindle the imagination of humankind and the fire of the souls of people, imbuing them with a glowing and ardent love for truth, justice, and peace. Those far and near will know the church is a great fellowship of love that provides light and bread for lonely travelers at night. The church, institutionally and its individual members, should claim King's legacy that mirrors the commitment of Jesus. Perhaps you will choose to watch Presiding Bishop Curry tomorrow. In a prepared statement ahead of his role as keynote speaker at the King Center's MLK celebration, Presiding Bishop Curry wrote this: we often ask ourselves how the life and legacy of people like the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. remain relevant in our current moment. And it would be difficult to overstate how much we need King's prophetic witness right now. From his tireless advocacy for the right of all Americans to vote, to his model of faith, animating nonviolent work for justice, King calls us to continue his work to truly labor for the realization of God's beloved community. For now, I'd like to conclude with Episcopal Bishop of Washington's Mary Ann Buday's short essay published the other day called The Jericho Road, which focuses on the last weeks of King's life. Bishop Buday wrote, "The spring of 1968 was, by all accounts, a chaotic time in the nation and the movement for civil rights and economic justice. King himself was struggling with exhaustion, depression, and a constant sore throat from his nonstop schedule of speaking engagements. Once the darling of mass media, King was now execrated by the press for his stance against the Vietnam War. A rising generation of black and student leaders were increasingly dismissive of nonviolence as a strategy for social change, given the intractable violence of forces against black Americans and demands for justice. While King never wavered in his commitment to nonviolence, he was repeatedly accused of inciting violence wherever he went. His inner circle of leaders were at odds with each other and with him. And moreover, the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, was on a personal mission not only to discredit King, but destroy him and all that he stood for. What is striking to me about this crucible time is King's humanity and the toll of all the pressures he was up against. He often faltered. Yet at critical moments, God gave him the capacity to draw from the depths of his own conviction, sense of destiny, and solidarity with Christ in order to speak to those looking to him for hope. The night before his death, King, citing illness and fatigue, initially chose not to attend the mass meeting to rally those planning to march to the city of Memphis the next day. But when his colleague, Ralph Abernathy, saw the crowd's disappointment, he summoned King from his hotel room. Arriving after 9 p.m., King rose to address several thousand people who had come out in a driving rainstorm. He spoke for nearly an hour, without notes, of what he knew to be true for himself and for the nation. Near the end of what would be his last public speech, King invoked the parable of the Good Samaritan as his rationale for being at Memphis. He pondered aloud all the reasons why two religious leaders would pass by a man wounded on the side of the road without stopping to help, while a man of despised race would choose otherwise. No doubt they had justifiable reasons not to stop, with which we could all identify. King had his own theory. He said, "It's possible that these men were afraid. You see, the Jericho Road is a dangerous road, winding, meandering, and conductive for ambushing. And so the first question that Levi asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me?" But then the Good Samaritan came by and reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? That is the question before you tonight. King saw in the sanitation workers' courage and solidarity what he wanted to invoke across the nation, a moment of poor people willing to stand with dignity and peacefully demand full inclusion in American society, including the right to secure safe working conditions and a living wage. He cast his lot with them for their sake and for us all. Let us move on in these days of challenge to make America what it ought to be, he told them. We have the opportunity to make America a better nation. 54 years since King's death, and at a time when so many of us are exhausted, stressed, and rightfully worried about the future of our country, I pray that we might draw strength and courage from King's examples and his words. We too will often falter, But in ways large and small, we have the opportunity to make our communities, this nation, and our world a better place. Amid all that your life demands, I pray that you may experience, as King did, God's giving you grace to draw from the depths of your convictions, sense of destiny, and relationship with Christ to offer what others are counting on from you. God only knows what it costs for you to make your offering. I hope you will feel God's gratitude. In one way or another, we are all walking the Jericho Road. How we respond to the people we encounter matters much more than we will ever know. As we make our way, may God give us strength to persevere in hope and to trust no matter the outcome, that our efforts to love, show up, and bear some of the suffering of this world will help bring about what King called the beloved community, God's dream for us all. And to Bishop Bode's sermon, I say amen.
Amen.